Hello you guys, and welcome back to another review of the Crunchyroll anime known as Mysteria Friends. So if you have not already watched my previous video, the link will be in the description and you can watch that video and catch up if you'd like. Thank you for everyone who has watched the past video. I really do appreciate it. So let's get into the second episode of Mysteria Friends, and this episode is titled Agony of Gria. So we start off in a red-hued room, and we hear sounds of what comes off as pleasure at first, if you know what I mean. We then learn that those sounds are the sounds of pain, coming from our lizard lady of the hour, Gria. Gria is apparently sick with an abnormal illness. The two women who are treating her have never seen anything like what Gria is suffering from. As Gria moans and pulls at her bed sheets in agony, the women reveal that they don't even know how to treat a dragonborn. An, sweaty and out of breath, opens the door and stares at her distressed friend. The nurses tell An that they've tried various forms of healing on Gria, from spells to herbs, but they have worked to no avail. The nurses then say that Gria's body has no external injury whatsoever. Then our resident, no evil, clumsy character Lu walks in carrying a stack of books, which she proceeds to drop. Lu brought the books because she thought they might be helpful in relieving Gria of her mysterious illness. One of Gria's caretakers notices a somewhat lewd book in the pile on the floor and asks Lu how did she get access to a prohibited book. An hears this while she is holding the hand of Gria. An then gets up and rushes out of the room. Her guard, Owen, who we were introduced to at the end of the previous episode, who was waiting outside, goes off with her as well. An and Owen make their way to a mysterious chamber that appears to be off limits to most students, given that An has to use a magic object in order to gain entry. This chamber is shrouded in a dark misty fog and is covered in what looks like red glowing webs. An then uses her magic to open a large door within the chamber, which leads to a long hallway, which they then run into. We cut back to Gria with Lu kneeling at her bedside. Lu then asks one of the caretakers where An ran off to. The caretaker tells Lu that she believes that An went to the forbidden archives of the library. We then cut back to An and Owen, and they are both traversing a sea of cubes that serve as bookshelves. They are searching through them for a book that could possibly help Gria. Whatever dimension they found themselves in within the forbidden archives of the library seems to be devoid of our usual physics, as they can move in almost any direction. We then cut to An and Owen running through a dark forest with a giant creature chasing after them. An then uses her magic to repel the creature. We then cut to An and Owen and the skeleton of a creature, and An is kneeling down at an altar that has the skull of what appears to be a dragon and a book beside it. An then touches the skull and absorbs some information through her hand. They then leave. We cut back to Gria, and she's in much more discomfort than before. The caretakers then start to make a medicine that will lower her fever. Meanwhile, An and Owen use magic in order to walk over a large body of water. At a certain point over the water, they stop using magic and plunge headfirst into its depths. Within the water, the pair surround themselves in a bubble in order to breathe. They float to the bottom, and An absorbs some information from what appears to be a sunken, ruined wall. When An does this, a device in the normal part of the library begins to activate, with students around it taking notice. The device implodes, and An and Owen appear in its destruction. An then tells Owen that they need to gather everything on a tablet that she has. I'm assuming a tablet of ingredients that they need for Gria, of course. An then panics because she doesn't know where to get the final ingredient, which is a dragon scale. We cut back to Gria, and she rises out of bed and begins to glow. Lu and the caretakers are worried as to what is happening. An then bursts through the door, and we see Gria glowing in different shades of bright colors, almost like a rainbow. Cracks then begin to form over her lizard-like tail. I know that sounds nasty, but like, that's what happened. Her skin then begins to break open all across her body. I know that sounds like disgusting, but it didn't look like that at all. I'm just like having a hard time describing like how that went down. Her body then turns into a newer, more evolved version of itself, almost like a snake shedding its skin. Her hair is now much longer, and her body appears to be more voluptuous than before. Gria then looks at An and says good morning, like nothing ever happened. An then begins to cry and hugs Gria. We then cut to a little while after, and Gria reveals to An that this is a sort of metamorphosis that happens every once in a while in her life. I'm assuming this happens every once in a while in the typical Dragonborn's life. Gria then notices that An is holding something behind her back and asks to know what it is. An then says it's nothing. We can see that it's the now shedded skin of Gria's tail. Gria then realizes that it's her shedded skin and An says she's keeping it to remind Gria of how much she's grown. Gria calls An a dummy, and then we cut to the credits. In the after credits scene, as we always, seem to get in this series, we see Gria sitting on her bed and she's measuring the girth of her new tail. She then is disappointed because she feels that she's gotten fatter, even though this is a part of her process as a dragonborn. She then tries to perform various tasks around the house in order to take some weight off of her tail, but it ends up with no results. Later that day, An and Gria are having breakfast, and An tells Gria to give her a shake, to which Gria then thinks An is referring to her tail, and An then corrects her and tells her that she was referring to the salt. An then takes note to the incredibly small portion size of Gria's breakfast. An then notices how Gria is acting and believes she is hiding something behind her. An then outsmarts Gria and runs around the table to get a look, and she tells Gria in her most cheerful manner that her tail looks great. Gria then sadly walks off, and the scene then forms into the pages of a book. So one thing that I noticed is that with these like end credit scenes where like the scene kind of zooms out and it ends up into like the pages of some old worn book, right? I'm assuming it's kind of like a thing where the show is kind of telling us it knows that it's a fantasy book. So, kind of like that. And I'm not too bothered by that whatsoever. I actually enjoy the idea of the book letting us know that it's kind of aware that it's, a fantasy universe, but in my opinion, I thought this was a very interesting episode. It didn't have as much world building as I would have liked, but I still think it was a rather good episode. Kind of almost like a filler episode, if you know what I mean. In this episode, we learned that the Dragonborn go through a sort of molting period. We also learned that the library is literally made up of various dimensions. In this episode, I also like how we get to see how much An really cares for Gria by going out of her way to, traverse the dangerous areas of the Forbidden Archive in the library. And even when An learns that it was all for nothing, she isn't even mad with Gria. She's just happy to see that she's doing well again, like any good friend would do. I also like how this episode defies the typical anime trope of what is known as the animation bump. So if you don't know, the animation bump is defined as when the pilot episode or the first few episodes, in some cases, has the highest quality of picture and animation. So even though this can last for the first couple of episodes, most of the time the animation and design is somewhat cut back only after the first episode. In my opinion, the second episode still looked as good as the first episode, and I hope this trend, continues. Usually studios do that because number one, it costs a lot of money to sit there and meticulously illustrate every single ounce of a scene, number one. And number two, it's done to hook you in to the animation, right? And usually more or less the hope is that instead of getting hooked onto the animation, you'll get hooked onto the story, But in my opinion, the second episode still looked as good as the first, and I hope this trend does continue. But for all we know, we may hit episode 3 next week, and the animation could be, very low quality. But with the way that this season is going and the fact that they have to kind of establish themselves as a new anime, I believe that that's a rather low possibility. We also still have not been introduced to an antagonist yet, with the entity coming closest to this was the library guardian from the previous episode that An had defeated. Maybe in this show we won't have an antagonist, and maybe it's just the main characters dealing and solving problems around the school. But those are really my thoughts. I'm sorry that I didn't have too much to say, because a lot of stuff really didn't happen that much, so it is what it is. Anyways, so thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you have any suggestions for any other shows you would like me to recap and review, leave them down in the comments below. And once again, thank you guys for watching. Bye.